This is our 33rd Dialogic Pedagogy podcast, and the topic that Charles sponsored, and he's here, he'll start first, is dialogue as transformative boundary crossing. And so far, here we are. My name is Anna Marjanovic-Shane. We have Charles Beasley from New Zealand, for whom it is early morning Saturday. We have David Garcia Romero from Spain. He's at the moment, I think, in Galicia, but you can correct me if not true. We have Carlos Lopez Leiva from New Mexico, and you can tell where exactly you are, and Eugene Matusov. And Mark Smith was here for a little while, and I hope he gets back. Something happened to him. All right, so let's start on this fantastic, interesting topic. And since Charles, you sponsored it, please tell us, what did you mean by that, by the transformative boundary crossing? What did you have in mind?
It seems to me that boundary crossing is a commonly used phrase for a whole lot of different things in education, both theory and practice. And one of the things is, a long time ago, we used to use this phrase as teachers that if transfer of learning had occurred, the phrase we used to use, a transfer of learning a long time ago, to say that if the children had been schooled or mastered some skills or strategies or acquired some knowledge, if they could transfer that into a new situation or area of knowledge, then learning had really occurred. But it seems to me that this new notion of boundary crossing we have is a very contemporary one, because we know that children and young people and any learner occupy a variety of spaces and discourses and places when they're learning. And even though we might try and just say they're in one space when they're learning, we know that they're not. We know that there are lots of spaces. I think, my colleagues in tertiary say, their students in lecture theatres are always on their telephones, even at the same time as they're listening. So, I mean, that's a kind of quite commonplace understanding of it, but I didn't really mean that. So I was thinking about some time ago, and please, if someone else would like to make the theoretical connections better than I can, but was there someone called Ackerman who talked about boundary crossing, and there are 4 different kinds of mechanisms by which boundary crossing occurs, and that it went all the way from defining the different learning contexts that you were in, all the way to that was one kind of boundary crossing where you didn't necessarily cross the boundary, but you saw the territory you were in relationship to other ones, but all the way through to boundary crossing, which for the learner was transformative. So I was interested in the boundary crossing that is transformative, and I thought, insofar as we talk about territories, I narrow it down to different discourses. So I'm thinking about the different contexts of learning as being different discourses, and I'm thinking about what that might mean. And then I'm thinking about the fact that when you do cross from one boundary to another, that can be transformative. And in particular, maybe we could start off with thinking about dialogue as transformative boundary crossing. I'm thinking about what we refer to when we think that dialogue is ontological or becomes ontological. So, and also maybe it is a kind of, it is the, when I'm thinking about children, so I'm thinking about the context of children. When I speak about this, I'm thinking about their meta-linguistic or meta-cognitive awareness that they have when they've done that, or how that changes them. So how that boundary crossing is like postupok, a significant event which changes their sense of who they are as a learner. Mm-hmm. Is that an adequate introduction?
Great, but can you give us an example, maybe? You must have something in mind that actually happened by some event when you're talking about that.
Yeah, so there would be 2 things. So you would know, how would you know that this boundary crossing that occurs as a result of a boundary crossing? So let's say I've just, with a group of children, made a theatre piece, and then they're 8, 9, and 10 years old, so they're quite young, and they have never done this. A lot of them have never done this before, so this is a new experience. And we made up a play using kind of theatre and drama processes. We made up a play about, it came from children's sense of a deep feeling that a lot of children have a sense of abandonment. Even though they have very nice parents, and a lot of these children have stable homes, they're not children in a difficult situation. Nonetheless, they have this intellectual feeling of, this existential feeling of being abandoned, you know, which is so interesting. And they're all reading, I noticed all these children are reading these kind of classics of English literature, which are about children who are orphans, or they're reading the Diary of Anne Frank and really relating. I'm thinking, why? They haven't anything like this. So we made up a play in which these children could go to a world in which these existential issues no longer applied. And we created this world. And anyway, I don't want to go through the whole process of what happened, but there are two things that are very significant about this. First of all, when the children come back into the normal classroom with me later and have their normal discourse, they say how much we miss being in doing that, how much we miss being in that play. If only we could go back there, if only we could do that again, because it was nothing like what we normally do. But secondly, some parents come to me and say, my child comes home and talks to me about what we're doing, and they talk about you. And I said, oh, yes. She said, I'm astonished because they talk about you as if you're just another person they talk to. And they have no respect for you. We're kind of quite alarmed about this. And they're saying, I told Mr. Bisley he was completely wrong. This was a bad idea. He wouldn't mind my new idea. I got the script and underlined the places. And she said, my child never does things like this. How come this has happened? And so I say, because they're having this dialogue with me and creating this work, it's not a dialogue based on agreement. It's a dialogue based on let's say, the Bakhtinian idea of polyphony of voices. Because they're having this dialogue with me, they are changing, and the whole class is taking themselves into a new place where there is this kind of equity or equality, equal rights of voices and all that kind of thing. And the children talk like that. And then one of the kids, to give you one more example, she's 9 years old, and she said, she wrote this little thing to me saying, they sometimes write dialogue to me, and she wrote this dialogue to me saying, dear Mr. Bisley, the real question about this play is who made the play up. I don't mean, I know we're making the play up, he said, but the thing I want to know is who made the idea up? And I'm thinking, what does this mean? She said, because when you consider the idea that we could live in a world where there are no more questions, because the world we made up was a world with no more questions. He said, if we lived in such a world, that would change everything about life. All the things that we thought to up to now would have no meaning. This is from someone who's 9, you know. So I'm thinking to myself, well, this child has transformed their learning. This was the one who was interestingly making these new comments to me. So the change in her social relationship with me and with the rest of the class too, because she was quite solitary up to now, all those changes indicated to me she had crossed a boundary, and it was kind of quite transformative. And that was in the terms of her metasocial and metalinguistic learning. And I could give you a whole lot more, but that's just a start. So that project was the reason why I was watching these 9-year-olds thinking, they are phenomenal. What are they doing here? And of course, I think the final thing is children's experience of theatre. Normally they get on stage, you know, and we all sit there as indulgent parents and think, oh yeah, that's cute. It's not theatre, right? And you think that, but then when you see the way children have this kind of creative agency actually on stage. So normally when children go on stage, it's this kind of cutesy performance, and their learning power or their sense of identity is kind of fake, or it's overblown or rhetorical or something awful. But when you see children actually generating some kind of creative power and making sense in that moment, this moment of acting, this is what theatre theorists call about the illuminating and heightened experience of acting, or that state of flow, you know, Elizabeth Ellsworth, Places of Learning, the child totally absorbed in this activity. But when that's on stage in front of an audience with a whole lot of other people, and they're taking this power for their own, that must also be another way in which they've crossed over and it was transformative too. Is that a good start?
We cannot hear you. Anna, we cannot hear you.
Oh,
Yeah.
can you hear me now?
Yeah. Sorry, I had it muted so that it doesn't interfere. I see at least three boundaries. Maybe you mentioned more boundaries, but I
Anna,
conceptually,
why don't we ask other people and check
yeah,
what other people
yeah,
think about
okay.
that, just
That's
one by one?
mhm.
Let's start with Carlos, since he is on my right.
Well, I would go like this because I see you below me. So
We have different boundaries.
Oh, very interesting.
yeah. So Charles, I think you made me think about a lot of many things, and I appreciate that very much. The first thing is, we know about boundaries and how boundaries limit things, right? So
Mhm.
when we are crossing a boundary, it feels to me that you're kind of breaking the rules. You're kind of going beyond because you are not respecting the boundaries. You're kind of transgressing.
Mhm.
And when you are transgressing, in a way, I kind of see that there's already a transformation, right? You're transforming the boundaries by crossing them. So
Mhm.
when you are qualifying boundary crossing with transformative, I
Mhm.
was wondering, what do you mean by transforming? Because to me, a boundary crossing is already a transformation. So, but when you want to qualify that with transformative, I'm wondering, what do you really mean by transformative?
Mhm. Shall I answer now? Yeah. Can you hear me? Okay. So I think the idea. I know. I said I wasn't going to do that, but I just, in my usual way, just had so many different things I talked about there. But that was from the example of the children. It's difficult to just adequately theorize it quickly. But what I mean was, first of all, it transformed. It transformed the learner or the learners, and they wrote and talked to me, and they said things to me which showed that they were transformed. How were they transformed? Well, I'm saying I can't say anything more ambitious than their sense of who they were as learners was transformed. Whether they were transformed more deeply like than that, I would say I don't know that. And why were they transformed? Because their experience of learning was transformed, and in particular, their agency as learners. So I'm saying it transformed the kind of agency that they had or felt as learners. And what else was transformed? The voice and the language that they used. And so the transformation was that up to that time, they learned in a kind of way, in an largely institutionalized way, which they quite liked and which they were part of, and most of them were successful at, which was a kind of instructional scene. And then by doing this other kind of thing, not only did they cross a boundary into a different context of learning, but somehow they generated a dialogue between them, which was a transformation of their usual way of relating to each other. So there was a personal transformation, but I don't think that makes any sense to speak of that unless you say there was also somehow a shared discourse that they had as a result of doing that, hence dialogue as transformative boundary crossing. So the dialogue, you would say, was both the cause and the result, the outcome of doing it, but it was also unintended in the sense that the outcome of the project was to make this work, this theatre work, as a result of making that theatre work, of going into that new territory, which they don't normally do in class, crossing that boundary, there were a social and personal transformation of those children, let's say in terms of agency.
I understand what you're saying. I guess what I was thinking about is, for example, if I cross a boundary,
Mm-hmm.
I feel that that's already transformative, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I broke the rules. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm kind of already starting to see different things in me because I I crossed that boundary. I could have respected it, but
Mm-hmm.
I crossed it. And so when I crossed it, I feel that it's already I something changed.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering, when we have the dialogue, as you were thinking about is that the result, or is that a reflective process of the transformation?
Mm-hmm.
And what is the transformation? Is the transformation actually crossing the boundary, or talking about that crossing? You know, so I'm kind of wondering about that.
So I would say that you can this is a kind of, if we use that 4-stage model from Ackerman, he starts off by saying you can just come up to the boundary, even cross it, and all that you're doing is defining the different boundaries and all the territories are intact. I don't think, Carlos, that when the children cross those boundaries here and there, incidentally, I don't think that those boundaries were dissolved. They still existed. They're still there. They're still there. But maybe one thing I could say about those boundaries is by the children crossing them, they have changed them, because after all, these are boundaries of discourse and language. So those boundaries become, instead of closed boundaries, they become porous boundaries. But in the Swedish studies about, in a Finnish study about this that I read about these Finnish school, I think the woman was called Kupulainen, wrote about this. She said that the purpose of the border was to create, it enabled better communication. I would disagree with her. I would say that the border, up to that moment, the children had crossed blandly because it was like being in the EU. They crossed from Switzerland to Germany, or Germany to Austria without any notice. Now the children notice the border a whole lot more than they did before. So just as learners, they cross all kinds of divides. They go from digital learning to real learning, and they go from learning inside school to outside school without really thinking about it. But now, so what you said is, I think, the key thing. Now there is a kind of reflective dimension to the way that you do that. So that sense, the boundary crossing is different from the normal boundary crossing when they're not aware of perspective taking and of the differences between the other kinds of learning so much. Now they're aware of it. Now they share it. Now they think, this is a boundary. This is a difficulty. That's why they say, we miss the play so much. We want to go back to that because they like that way of being able to be as learners.
Anna, we cannot hear you.
Yes, Eugene.
Yeah, I'm just listening to you, and I'm thinking about returning Bakhtin, not because Bakhtin was a saint and we should listen always Bakhtin, but I think it's, I'm used, not always, but often, about his crazy ideas. And I just want to bring his crazy ideas to our discussion, because for him it was not about crossing boundaries, but living on the boundaries. And he said that culture doesn't have internal territory. So it's not, and also from that point of view, that it's not about transformation in a sense that, okay, we are constant and then transform. Transformation is maybe not the right even word for capturing that. It's more like living on boundaries. And in this case, boundary means completely different than crossing. It's contact. How I understood at least. So, for example, Bakhtin said there is boundary, there is culture doesn't have internal territory. And I think you can extend that. Truth doesn't have internal territory. Meaning doesn't have internal territory. And so on and so forth. So we actually live when we're in contact with somebody who is different than we are. In this case, we're always on the boundary. And those people who are trying to create boundaries in different sense is kind of keeping people away, to almost like imprisoning people, because they cannot get to the contact. Not about crossing, it's a different thing. They get in the contact with other people in a way. It's my view, it's shame. And of course I'm thinking about situation in the United States a little bit, about this border crisis and border artificial that are created by Trump. But on the bigger scale, I think that type of borders, the borders that do not allow people to move freely, to be in contact with other people, I think it's very inhumane. And I don't know, Elina, if you know, there is a famous, Elina also speaks Russian, and she is from Soviet Union. That's why I addressing to her. But I learned recently very interesting words by the Russian or Soviet poet Evgeny Yevtushenko, who said something like that: borders, national borders. He talks about national borders. He said this is scars on the face of the earth, or on the body of the earth. And that type of borders is very in my view, very oppressive borders. And this is not borders that we should kind of try to recreate or celebrate or whatever. It's a more border as a contact. And in this case, again, it's not about crossing them, but living on these borders, because I think they create such a creative potential. This is where human life happens, with other people who are different than me. Okay.
I actually was, I was thinking, I think in kind of the same line, because I read dialogue as boundary crossing, I thought, I will say the dialogue is more about boundary constituting, or boundary creating. Dialogue is what kind of boundary is set on dialogue, and what is maybe transformed on dialogue is the boundary itself and its meaning, even not the self of the students, but meaning itself, meaning that might be about the students and might themselves, but also might be about rules. That's why I do like Carlos' idea about dialogue as transgression, and but that transgression is not necessarily about themselves, not also necessarily about the rules of class. It might be any kind of interest or idea that they were testing or experimenting. But the thing is that the movement, I think, is the boundary that is moving, the boundary that is changing on dialogue, because meaning from one and other side talking and addressing each other, it's changing. And so it's a border, I'm repeating myself, sorry. But I have something more that, yes, and that at the same time might entail a boundary crossing, but that's not dialogue itself. That might be things that happen after dialogue. But dialogue can entail boundary crossing, but it's not itself boundary crossing. Meaning that the use of the meaning, if you want, or the knowledge created through dialogue can, or the consequences can entail that that the students are in a place that weren't before. But actually, that's coding from us, I think. That's it's we who are seeing the border, who are seeing the boundary and saying, well, students were first not attentive and now attentive. They crossed this border. It's me who, as a teacher or researcher, I draw that border. And that's not about dialogue. That's about research, maybe. That might also be about teaching and observation. But dialogue is not my observation. Dialogue is what happened between them or between me and them in that moment. So I think it's interesting to consider these consequences on dialogue, but I wouldn't confuse it with dialogue itself. I might be going a little bit harsh on this, but I think it's different. It's different things. What comes from dialogue than dialogue itself. And yeah, I share that idea of the living in the border, and actually dialogue is really living, really being there, meeting someone. And you cannot meet someone if it's not in a border. It's not possible.
Mm-hmm. Elina, you say something first.
I think I wouldn't juxtapose two meanings of the boundary that are emergent, or many meanings of the boundary that are emergent. But I think going back to what Eugene said, going back to Bakhtin, that culture doesn't have internal territory. It only have the next phrase, the next sentence in this quote is, culture only happens on the boundary in a dialogue with another culture. So boundary is a particular position that is not that easy to occupy. And it doesn't really, so sustaining yourself on the boundary, on the border, in a dialogical space, kind of requires specific effort. Because it's not a very comfortable position, because you are not really you are in between. You are in between. So being in between. Another context is, I'm saying also, I also agree with those who say crossing the boundary, but in a completely different sense. If we look at knowledge, as it was perceived for many years, that you need to have an expertise, right? So that concept of expertise, being within the boundary of a field, of a particular discipline or something, that is not actually becoming current, because currently to have an expertise, you need to be fluent in multiple modes and multiple disciplines as a learner, and being just kind of crossing the different boundaries and being in multiple contexts at the same time. And that positioning is also uncomfortable and difficult to occupy. And I think that is yes and no. You need to cross the boundary. You need to understand where is the border for a particular discipline to address the other one, and be in the moment, in the context where both of them present. But I wanted to bring another, what I was also thinking is the concept of identity. And, you know, Kenneth Gergen wrote a wonderful book, Transformational Self, I believe. Oh, no, Relational Self. And he talks about that in the context of postmodern reality, we don't really have a core identity. Mm. So because being agents in multiple contexts and being kind of performing different selves in different communities of practice, in different research communities, or different cultures, our identity is fluid rather than being core. Mm-hmm. So we also crossed the boundaries of our value systems, the ways we operate, the ways we present ourselves, and that's another positioning. So I think it's this multiple context of that.
Anna?
That's very interesting, and I was just going to talk about something similar where you said living on the boundary is a difficult thing to do, because living on the boundary means not only that you're going into some unknown territory, but also that you are opening and disclosing a lot about yourself that you maybe even didn't know yourself before, and that you could only see on that boundary where you are creating the boundary with another person or with another culture or in another context, that you suddenly things open up for you too, but you may be vulnerable because you yourself are experiencing some aspects of yourself that you didn't know about before, and that maybe you did not want to say. I was just reading recently some students and teachers, future teacher students, talking about their future and their past experiences, about the need to be relaxed and the need to be to have this ease with people who are in that community, that you can actually start experimenting on that boundary, because it's so dramatic. Maybe that's sometimes necessary, sometimes maybe the opposite is necessary. Eugene and I are involved in some project about very interesting professor from Princeton from the 60s, Martin Duberman, who also actually had a feeling that he had to bring some aspects of theory, therapy into his class, because he also saw that the students and himself were kind of like stuck or had some kind of dysfunctionalities, and that he needed to create some kind of encounter group too. And so that's the question, like, how do you design this boundary in education, these boundary spaces? Chris Gutierrez talked about the third space also, where there is this somehow flow in which you can flow of various things on that touch, where people touch each other, and where things can, I think when maybe one way to understand the word transformation is that there is something flowing there that is strange and new and dangerous sometimes. And I think that that's one of the things that's interesting to think how to conceptualize that. That's what I would say.
Mark?
Thanks. Yeah, I'm sorry, I had some trouble with my audio. I couldn't. You could see me, but I couldn't hear anything, so I had to restart my computer. But anyway, from what I gathered from the discussion, what I was able to hear, I think there's. It's interesting to me to sort of problematize the idea when we talk about boundaries. There's this kind of assumption that we have these shared realities that are somehow that we are, living in cultures that have particular dynamics or ways of acting and doing things. I'm talking a lot about genre recently, and I'm working on a paper on that, kind of doing a dialogic critique of genre pedagogy. And one of the things that's interesting me is this notion that genre is the assumption that genre is a shared set of expectations or shared set of practices. And the more we see them as shared, the more we create boundaries between those genres, the more we end up reifying the boundary, creating something which actually doesn't exist. Like this, for giving an example, a lot of this language pedagogy stuff, academic language pedagogy stuff, is so focused on the internalization, shared forms as authoritative guides. I'm trying to think of the language they're using right now. It's escaping me, but for production. And my concern has been that, well, wait a minute though, but we're postponing meaning making in order to teach people the quote unquote shared ways that exist on these, that there's a boundary between how I write and how the genre writes. And the problem is that then people aren't engaged in production. They're engaged instead in pattern recognition, in trying to match what they think exists on the other side of this gulf between themselves and the way they write or the way they produce. And I think that's very destructive in some ways, because it's generating a boundary, or it's reifying a boundary and making that so, difficult to see that, here I am, and here's this huge boundary of genre. And, and so what I end up doing is thinking of, well, how is it that I can produce in this form? I'm never going to be able to get there. It's this gap. And I've been sort of thinking about, well, wait a minute, like, why are we doing this? Like, we're trying to get students to become authors of their own ways of writing and speaking or whatever. Let's deconstruct these genres. Let's have people, get together and from different disciplines and look at these, texts or whatever, and just break them apart. And maybe the boundaries and the cultures and all this stuff look much different out of the context of if we stop looking at them as these shared realities as forms like that. It's interesting to think about it that way.
Are you saying that genre doesn't have boundary?
I'm saying that the boundaries aren't. I'm questioning the degree to which there exists these shared forms that we believe are so strong that in a way I'm questioning the boundaries between the genres. Yes.
Well, let me jump on that, because I think in my view, our conversations leads to that point that actually to, like, let's say genre. Genre exists only when we constantly transcend it. When we talk in genre, it means we are new with the genre. It's true, we can recognize a genre in talking, other people talking, or ourselves talking, but we recognize it because we're going beyond of that. When this transcendence become illegitimate, then it's become transgression. This is what Carlos, in my view, and to some degree Charles was talking about, because the culture, especially in education, conventional education, the whole culture is ready-made. It's established by adults, right? Shakespeare and everything, it's adults thing. Who are you? This is what kind of voice, kind of hidden voice that directed to the students. Who are you to talk about that? You need to learn that first. When you learn that, then we will listen to you. And in this case, any real talking to this, which means transcendence, suddenly become transgression, because it become illegitimate in that context. You first need to learn the genre or learn Shakespeare, and then we will listen to what you want to say about that. How can you say about Shakespeare if you didn't read even Shakespeare? Wait until we study that in school. When you finish your education, then we will going to listen to you, whatever you want to say, maybe. If you prove, if you have PhD, if you have all these credentials, we will listen to you. But Bakhtin actually calls for this consciousness with equal rights. In this case, everybody has right on transcendence. Everyone have right to cross the boundary of the given to something unique, to something creative. And everyone can have ear of seriousness of listening to this transcendence and judge that. Is it good transcendence? Not good, whatever. Beautiful, ugly, what we think about that. And I think this, in a way, what I hear, Charles, maybe I'm wrong because you're working with these kids, but I hear these kids in your lessons, they kind of suddenly feel they're there at home with this culture that is like high culture, whatever, Anne Frank, books, whatever. It's suddenly they can address it. It's another you rather than it's it to study. And I think to some degree this is what extremely exciting moment for the kids, if I'm correct in my analysis, to suddenly see this adult culture as something that they can dialogue about. They can be in contact. They're meeting it. Rather, it's it. It's you rather than it. And I don't know what you think about Carlos, Charles, and David, because I'm in your territories in a way.
I was thinking now because of actually from what Mark was saying about the very much refined borders, and what you were saying about the transcendence becomes transgression when it's illegitimate. I actually think this focus that we have on transformation shows how oppressive normally pedagogical regimes are, because transformation should be normal. Well, not transformation, but emergency change on meaning change and self change, if we want, in education should be kind of normal, that we need to focus on it and search for it and celebrate when transformation is happening. That it's kind of a point that it's something that should be happening more naturally is not happening, because we have kind of oppressive regimes that encapsulate things, and not only encapsulate, but rules inside that boxes, as general could be, are too rigid, too explicit, to not aim to transcend, but to internalize. Yes. I think I'm recalling now that what Anna was saying about third space. I don't know if Chris Gutierrez, when she made this notion, was at that point. But I do understand third space as a border, well, as a boundary created on a not maybe on dialogue, but yes, on culturally meeting, and on a purpose meeting, on different agents meeting on purpose. And we are talking about that in a research we have. And what I found interesting in that third space is similar to what Eugene was talking about, that they were legitimated to address adult literature as other. Well, you're talking about you. I don't know if it's another you or an other, but another to address. But the thing is that in that place, in that third space, or at least we understand it as that, they were addressing values of, in this case, of rules in classroom, of important things in classroom. They were addressing values legitimately, because they were very resistant at the beginning, because they are, what I think is they were used to listen to, yes, you can talk, you can say your point, but until the moment that it deviates a lot from what I think is acceptable as a teacher. I think students were used to that. So at the beginning, they were like, no shit, I cannot say what I am thinking right now. So we had to convince them that they could. And they were actually saying things that we could not like, but that doesn't matter. The thing is that they were legitimate to talk about it, and then we'll see if we do agree or not. But the thing is that in that point, one of the things we were talking about was interculturality and culture. And I think they did change the border or the boundary of what we thought was culture. For culture, we understood some things different than what students understood as culture. And don't know if I'm being a little bit messy, but what I think was important of this boundary making or boundary meeting in that third space is that they, in their dialogue, were drawing where culture is in their values, in what is important in their reality, and not what we thought as researchers that culture will be, and we were coding. And actually, maybe we could mess it up in our later analysis, but in that pedagogical event, I will say that the interesting thing that was that boundary drawing of them. Like here, we are meeting, we are talking about this. We have kind of disagreement here, so we are drawing this border, and we are seeing one place and another, and moving meaning from there. So yeah, I kind of mess a lot up, so I'll let speak another one.
Very interesting.
This is actually a very interesting example of you can transform the boundary or be on the boundary if you are aware of it. And the moment of resistance is the moment of awareness that it exists, or kind of reshaping it in a way to engage with it, because it's not necessarily like we assume it's there, but it's there for who? And why do we think it even there? That's why, you know, there are many different examples. I don't want to take a time. But it's also like going back to what Mark was saying, it's interesting because it connects in an interesting way to meaning making. I had an experience with six-year-olds when I was trying to teach them English through speech genres in an extremely oppressive school environment. And I said, talk to me as a London policeman. So we would watch that, and they would talk to me in whatever capacity they could. And I never realized anything when I was doing this, but the embodiment of new cultural kind of persona who would talk differently also helped to hold two positions, and it actually comes from, you know, Vygotsky group, but being able to hold two positions, myself and the other that is very, very different, and that I'm trying to impersonate with the language and everything, that was very developmental, or transforming them in a powerful way. Because I can be this and I can be that. That's very liberating in a way. But at the same time, it made them understand better of how other personas that speak English, sort of English, were actually doing that. So this context of the classroom changed tremendously when I was doing that, and how they behaved in their regular interactions with regular, like, classroom activities was also very different.
So I'm following on from what you said, Elina, that somehow or other that your actions in relationship to a group of children and reframing the pedagogy and the way they could also talk to you, does transform the classroom, the discourse, and so on. But I wanted to go back to something that David said that I disagree with very strongly. And that is, when I described the agentic, or the increase in agency in the children, it was somehow as if, David, you think in dualities. Here I was, the teacher and the researcher over here, and here the children were, and I was describing something that happened to them for research processes. Not at all. My observations were of a tremendous event that they took part in, that I was also part in, not as someone other than them, but I was also part of that, and they described that, not to me or for any purpose that I'd given them. They described it because it was their experience of learning, and my job in talking to you and having dialogue with you is to try and make sense of what I saw. I don't have a particular position that I took that I wanted to have, and I was aware in some sense, and I'm aware now when I'm talking to you, that I'm not explaining it very well. But one thing that I really agree with you about is that for us, what you say, David, is that this transformation, this kind of transformative boundary crossing, whatever it is, and I don't, incidentally, Eugene, I also agree with you that there is no internal territory when you describe that. I don't mean that when I say boundary crossing at all, going from the inside to the outside or something obvious like that. I also think that Chris Gutierrez's idea of the third space is far too simplistic to describe the kind of multi-overlapping territoriality that we have now. First, second, third space. It's far more complex than that. Maybe that was an interesting idea in the beginning. But I think boundaries are good and separation and distances are good. But the problem with pedagogy that we have now, this sort of instrumental pedagogy, I can speak for New Zealand, but I suspect it's in Britain and other places as well. The problem is it creates this kind of area where the boundaries aren't real anymore. You have a kind of undifferentiated space, almost like the internet, like you're there so that there is, you can't, if you don't have these difficult boundaries, which as Bakhtin says is where meaning making takes place, absolutely, this is where Gadamer says, you know, the medial event of language, that is on the boundary always, of course. But it seems that pedagogy, actually, its job is to disrupt and dissolve the boundaries so that you can't have this transformative or experience that somehow is more than you normally experience as a learner. And our Minister of Education, who has recently gone with a change of government, she said, this was her goal, and it's all to do with who assesses and evaluates learning. She said that we can see a clear journey. We can see every stage of the journey, and we want to know where children are on every point of that journey, from the time they start in preschool to the time they leave secondary school and beyond. We want to know where they are, and we want to be able to describe where they are. And she's got this idea of a linear process where there actually is no boundary crossing at all. It is all prescribed in advance, even who you are. And this is kind of totalitarian pedagogy. It's what Rancière says, actually, and this is another thing I think, it's not the fault of schools. It's actually the institution that's widespread throughout society, that we actually live in a pedagogicized society. And therefore, in that society, the boundary crossing becomes less and less. And I don't know what you're saying, Eugene, about refugees. I don't know how all these borders and boundaries and what's going on in Britain and everything else at the moment, trying to reinstate these boundaries, it seems totally incoherent that kind of political situation with this kind of rational pedagogy or instrumental pedagogy that we have invented for children, which to me is a far more serious and invidious and difficult thing to overcome, taking away all the boundaries so we have this seamless education system where everything is transparent. This is a far more serious situation as a kind of depoliticizing of putting territories and contexts in brackets, saying they're not important anymore. So when I see some children make a frivolous little piece of theatre, and when they say it has changed themselves implicitly, not directly, when I see a change in the power relationships, when I see a change in the way they're talking in the classroom, which is a complex space, I know that they are on the boundary, as Bakhtin would say. They are making meaning. And I know there is an ontological shift, whatever that means. Because after all, internal, external boundaries, these are all metaphors, aren't they?
Yeah, can I say something? I think that when you're talking about boundary, you're talking in that sense that Eugene said earlier, that it's making a contact. And when you make a contact with another person, with another human being, and you are in a position to really make meaning or make sense of everything that's going on, some sparks are there. But that also entails that there is no transparency of human mind. And those people who want to create everything transparent or imagine that they can know and that their indicators actually attest to what I think that attest is really totalitarianism. But I just read yesterday a very interesting article that studies the teachers in preschool education in Norway through something very interesting, because in Norway also they experienced their Ministry of Education trying to push on the preschool education some kind of a very big curriculum, also testing, also schoolifying the preschool education in the sense that they want to put these other boundaries, which I would call them walls or chains or something else completely opposite of what we are talking about. Yeah. And why I'm mentioning that, what's interesting there is that many teachers are against that, preschool education teachers. But on the other hand, what is in play here is that they are teachers are getting a status of being professionals by defined as professionals, not in the way how I would define them, but now they are serving the institution. They are not anymore babysitters. The school does not look like anymore like home. It's now this segregated place where there are some kind of a very strict processes that are predetermined going on. And some teachers like that, not because they take off their responsibility, but because they gain a status through that. They are not anymore considered to be just like tra-la-la little children and just, like changing their diapers. But on the other hand, they do feel that they are being taken autonomy as teachers and a possibility to be in a continuous invention and authorship of their curriculum and their teaching with these children. So it's a clash. Very interesting article.
And could
I'd like to comment. Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead, Charles.
I just wanted to say something to Eugene very quickly about, because Eugene and I we've had an ongoing discussion about Shakespeare. And I just wanted to say that the very reason that we are talking about genre and text and the children's ability, the very reason that when children take a Shakespeare text, they're not there to study a given meaning or ready-made meaning, even though that's what it could be and is in many schools. The children sit down with a text and read it and study the language and the literary genres and the characters and the context and all the rest. That's not the reason we do it. The reason we do it is, here is a cultural icon, which is something dead. If you can make it alive and you become the interlocutor and the children can speak it and it addresses them, this is an act also of transformation, because up to that moment, like I can tell you this right now, I'm with a class of children, we are about to stage Macbeth. This is a piece of hot cultural property. Everyone's like, oh my God, would you study Macbeth with 12-year-olds? Yeah, why? Because all their parents and everybody, they all know Macbeth if the children take this play and turn it into something their own. This is a commanding thing that they have done that gives them, you know, it gives them a whole lot of things that they wouldn't have if you took some obscure 20th century playwright. I beg the children this year, please, let's not do Shakespeare. Let's do something else. Come on. We've got all these other people we can do. Show us. I showed them all these plays. No, we don't want to do that. We want to do Shakespeare. They're really mixed up, right? They want to do Shakespeare. So we do Shakespeare. And because it turns from being the study of a text into something completely different, that is also a kind of boundary crossing, I suppose. But I apologize. We're now using boundary crossing in every possible way.
So the comment I wanted to make.
Yeah,
sorry, go ahead. No, I just had a question listening to all of you. Do you have to be aware of the boundary to cross it? Or can we, because it's like ongoing challenge of mine in a different way, in Columbia University, there was an argument. Do you need to master the culture before you can actually occupy the border or to be on the border? Mm-hmm. Or you engage in some activities that are maybe random or fluid and eventually you will kind of discover this border and then you can overcome it. So kind of two modalities of how you actually get there and how you can and there was also a very strong cultural tradition, for example, in Vygotsky and all these schools that strongly believe that in order to get on the border and question and transform the meanings, you need to master it thoroughly through it, like concepts and everything, and then you get there. And then there is an institutional belief, like at Ivy League schools in US, that it comes from a different perspective. Let's have all these multiple histories and fluid things, and so eventually maybe some of us will get there to that position where you can, you know, engage with something new. And it's not necessarily determined, it's not, but if we are saying that there is a transformational potential of occupying this position, engaging in a dialogue in a meaningful and transformative way, then from a position of teaching and learning or being a facilitator of change, like, how do we get there?
Where?
and where?
Mm-hmm. And we don't hear you, Eugene, because you're muted.
Carlos,
I just say a very simple thing, Carlos, and I think he understood me non-verbally.
So I guess what I'm commenting on, I think is connected to what Elina was mentioning, but I think it came especially from what David is saying. I think all of us, right? I think this is a wonderful conversation that I'm learning a lot about from. But what my comment resides on boundary making, right? So it seems that the boundary definition, the defining of the boundaries comes as a result of differences finding each other, and the boundaries start kind of coming up. And as that boundary is being defined, the idea of dialogue supporting, if you will, the boundary crossing could be helpful. But I was at that moment of trying to diffuse or cross the boundaries through dialogue is when I started thinking about the concept of third space that was brought up before. Third space is not only about what Chris Gutierrez says, and it's not only about second, first, and then third space. Soja says that the importance about third space is thirding as othering. And the thirding as othering is not a third option, but is giving us the idea that there are many other options, not only a third one, but there are many other options of being. So when we think about a dialogue of defining the boundaries and trying to address the boundaries that we are marking, the third thing as othering could be helping us to start thinking that maybe there is no boundary. Maybe the process of dialogue can help us to start seeing that there was no boundary. And so a third space can actually help us to start seeing that while we were focused on the differences, the third in as othering can help us to start seeing that there was no difference already, that we just made that difference happen because of what we were seeing. But now that we're taking a perspective, another perspective, we're using the third in as othering. We are othering the idea that we are two and maybe we can be one already. We were one already. So the boundary was not diffused because we crossed the boundary, but just because there was no boundary. We redefined what the boundary was through this process. And I want to just provide an example. There was this girl who was interacting in a group with peers, and she was very quiet. And then a group of people started talking about how she was acting in that group, being quiet. And they said, "You are shy. You were shy, that's why you were not speaking." And then another person said, "I don't think you're shy. Or were you shy?" And then she said, "I think I was not shy. I just didn't speak because that's what I felt was the best thing to do in that moment." So the discussion was about being shy versus not shy. And when the option came that maybe it was something else, but not being shy or not shy, it really helped her to find ways to identify herself on what she was doing. So sometimes the selection, the options that we have within the different boundaries that we create limit what we think we can do and how we connect and what is different and what is not different. And sometimes when we really find what the boundary is, we can find ourselves already, we can find more resources for ourselves to start seeing those boundaries and maybe see that they have already dissipated and we're together. I'm sorry, I'm talking too much.
Yeah, well, Carlos, I think you're raising a really good point that that I don't know if we've really addressed all that much yet, that sometimes without transcending these boundaries that we create between ourselves and, let's say, a text, or between ourselves and others, like, for example, I'm kind of interested in this notion of, I've also been working on a paper on social exclusion, and I've become really interested in how certain children end up becoming othered constantly and excluded from others, not so much because they are shy or because they are there's something we could extract as like different about them as an essential aspect of being, but just simply because they are they haven't had that experience to participate necessarily in dialogue with others, to understand how they are being perceived by others and how the other, to other themselves effectively, to have that experience of having oneself understood by the other. That is a gift, as Bakhtin talks about. That's the gift of dialogue. And we're kind of hitting this important point, I think, which is that sometimes, in many cases, I'm just imagining my students in a language course constantly being told, this is the model of how you're supposed to do things. This is the way things are. What you need to do is try to figure out how you might be able to just every day just get a little bit closer to the model. Every day it's like scaffolding, right? All right, I'm climbing up the mountain. But I never, the problem is that I am effectively being told implicitly that what I do is not good enough, and that how I write is not the way, or how I speak is not the, is not the gold standard, so to speak. And so the problem is as I was writing about, it's we get caught into these knots, of these. We constantly see ourselves as, what I do is not good enough, and what is good is defined by somebody else, not myself. And how do I get to this point if what I do can't possibly be as good as this, and da 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 da? It becomes a trap, an ontological trap. And I think we're kind of hit. I think you're kind of hit that a little bit about what that experience is like existentially for students. It's very difficult and confusing in many different ways when we're dealing with personal relationships, the way we handle interpersonal relationships in classrooms, which is not very dialogic. It's very, here's the recipe, and, the reason you have this problem is because you're bullying somebody else. That's defined outside of you as well. Everything that, we kind of experience in school, and for the most part, pedagogically, is in that sense where we don't have that opportunity to define what it is and how we think, and the way we want to be, so to speak. We can't define our own educational journey in that sense, and that becomes really difficult for people to learn how to I'm talking about very big ideas here, but to learn how to become, we're constantly being, in other words, what we're trying to do is constantly be defined by somebody else.
Can I jump on that? And I actually agree, Carlos, with you in spirit, and completely disagree with the form, what you said. It's actually the fact that these people, we need borders. And these borders, actually, the oppression that you describe in interesting form about the people discuss talking versus shyness, which means, if you think about that, it's about value of talking. People are active and engaged because they talk. Like right now, I'm very active and you're so passive. I just hate you all for being very passive, because I'm, to be active, it means to talk. And only right now, active person is Eugene. Everybody is so passive, damn. But, and it sounds like in school, especially, it feels natural. There is no boundaries there. When that girl, wonderful girl, she introduced completely different values of listening. Listen, there is a value in listening and not in talking. And people can be super active in listening. And it's no less value than talking, and sometimes even more value than talking. And suddenly we see boundary between these two ideas, between idea of valuing talking and ideas of plurality that valuing talking and listening. And people hearing these boundaries start thinking, which one I like more? They become master of that, rather than before they were colonized, because they couldn't even think about that, because there is no boundaries for them to think. There's only one thing, it feels very natural. The one who talk, you know how many instructors put on the active participation in class, which doesn't mean it's they coding people who talk. People who talking, they're active in class. And they don't see even how bizarre this idea is here, because it's not in contact with some other alternative ideas. And I think part of education is bringing these alternative ideas that suddenly you see boundary. Nothing is natural suddenly. Everything has become for consideration. There are values behind that, which invisible initially. Before, when they see, if there is no contact, everything feels natural. It's like in Russian, my mother-in-law, this is my favorite example with my mother-in-law. She's in the United States. And when she tells about something, she sometimes say, I told him in language, which means she speaks in English. На языке. But when she just speaks, it's just like, there's no language there, we just speak there. It's natural. People just speak. But when we them have to speak in English, we speak in language. because language, English is not natural way of, it's not human just communication. It's special kind of, it's difficult. You have to adjust to that. Like in Russian fairy tales, the animal speaks a human language. Of course, human language was Russian because it's invisible. Like speaking Russian is natural. This is how people speak. There is no other way of speaking. Like in Russian, the word German means mute person who cannot speak. Like German, blah, 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 blah. And for Greeks, barbarians, it's people who don't speak Greek. It's barbar. That's why they become barbarians. But it's because it's everything is natural, you know. And breaking this naturalness, it's exactly creates this contact, meeting place. When something is only, wow, there is alternative way of thinking about things, which is, I didn't even see that possibility before this boundary happened. And I think this exactly education is bringing these boundaries in a sense of bringing contacts with something that is different to dear ideas of the students and of course adults as well, it doesn't matter, teachers. And that's in my view what education is. Okay.
I just wanted, I'm just wondering whether we can talk about it context free, because from what Carlos was saying, and I experienced it bringing people from different cultures together in the situation where there is a dominant culture and there is a second-hand culture, or there is a third-hand culture, and those borders, I won't call them boundaries in Bakhtinian sense, but the borders, the people are separated already and segregated in a particular social groups because of the language they speak. And this is not context-free. So in this situation, addressing those divisions rather than and creating boundaries that you can understand, and at the same time common spaces where those borders are like artificially created, segregational groupings, borders are dismantled, is an opening of a dialogue. Without that, you cannot really engage. And when I was teaching New York City teaching fellows, and when I discovered they all can talk politically correct about racisms, but when we started talking about gender and sexuality, nobody had language. And no matter what, there was no, the boundary was, we don't know how to speak about that. And then we had to address why all of you feel safe to blah, blah, blah about racism without even feeling safe, but you cannot talk about gender and sexuality. And that was an interesting moment of awareness. So what I'm saying, I'm not quite sure that every border is a boundary, and every division is a boundary.
Yeah. No, of course, there are some borders that creates prisons. Mm-hmm. And so the people cannot get in contact with others, of course. Yeah, that's why the word borders and boundaries are so polysemic, and sometimes it's confusion because sometimes you hear one thing, but the person means kind of almost opposite things by using the same term, unfortunately. Yeah, but indeed.
But also translation, because there is also like lost in translation situations. So maybe it is helpful to sort of conceptualize when we speak about boundary, how is it different from other sorts of divisions and separations.
We're trying to define a boundary between borders and boundaries.
Exactly, that's what I wanted to say. There are borders that are kind of walls that separate people, and boundaries that bring people in contact and in touch, and those are completely opposite.
Could we think of borders temporarily, or boundaries in a temporal way? Could we think of them as unfinalized, to use Bakhtin's idea, and to say that if we think of a narrative as being the places, you know, the chronotope, knots tied and untied and all those kind of concepts, this is the area where meaning has been made. This is where the gaps are. This is where something is unfinalized, where we haven't arrived at meaning, whereas the territory is where the meaning has been established. I'm very interested in one particular idea I want to give to you, because Eugene was talking about the Russian thing, the idea of everything being natural and the things outside not being natural. We have a very interesting thing here with our colonized people, the Maori, who are very strong in their own culture and all the rest. And they would regard, in an interesting way, to all Maori, the Maori world as being the place where spiritual meaning is guarded and preserved. All the world to do with taxation, driving your car, going to the bathroom, all that world is in a different territory. That belongs to the colonizer. But we are the people who have the special spiritual world, to all Maori, related to some very profound concepts they have, which the colonizing people are excluded from. So they have created a very strong territory around they have the spiritual world at their fingertips. And the outsider, that's me, doesn't. It might be true, who knows?
Yeah, this is very interesting issue about you know, the keeping this almost like that conservative conservative not in political sense but in just literal meaning of the word, to conserve, to preserve something. It's kind of the preservationist mode. I actually remember watching in early 90s a wonderful documentary which I cannot find because I couldn't remember. I know where I watched that in Santa Cruz, and I think it was my advisor who showed that, Barbara Rogoff, but she also couldn't remember that. The documentary was the following. It's about Inuit Native Americans who lived in the north of, I think in Alaska. And there is a big debate within them, among specifically people who are doing some jewelry and in traditional way. And one of the Native American artists was accused by others Native American artists. He's betraying the culture because he started using different instruments, modern instruments, and modern themes in their and using many things that not traditional in a way. And so they're saying that you're betraying our culture. And his reply was amazing from my point of view. He said that I'm actually a traditionalist and you are not, you're betraying the culture. Because our people in past will utilize anything that ocean will bring. For example, there was some shipwreck that's happened in the sea, in the what is called North Ocean. And there was a European ship there before even we were in contact with Europeans, but they will bring to the shores and we use that and utilize that, everything that ocean will bring to us. And that's the tradition. What you're trying to do is creating a museum out of this. And I was thinking, what does it mean to be alive, for culture to be alive? And to be even traditional culture, what does it mean to be? It's a very interesting debate, and I think it's very interesting to think about Charles in the context of the Maori situation, like who is, in that sense, traditional Maori, the ones who said, okay, this is us, when we're kind of closing that up, and Charles cannot be ever part of this, or the ones who say, yeah, Charles can be, and we can dance about that. So it's an interesting question.
I think the reason, incidentally, that the Maori people are so strong is because they are very open to all kinds of other cultural influences, and it's a constantly dynamic and evolving situation with them. So when the colonizers came to New Zealand, they had a lot of strength in the things that they did until they had some really nasty tricks pulled on them. But up to that moment, they were able to take things and be open to them and change in a positive way that they like to change. So, I mean, I'm really speaking out of turn here about that, but just to say that I don't think it is a necessarily conservative position, Eugene, but just the idea that our territory is a spiritual one is an interesting idea. Mm-hmm. Not in that, yeah.
Yeah, I also want to say what you reminded me with is again that Bakhtin talked about the consciousness with equal rights. And all these traditionalists, not traditionalists, dominant culture, not dominant, is about having different power and different rights, not the same rights. And that those forces of not being equal rights is what stops or prevents or obstructs or not transforms, but really distorts the dialogue, where then different ideas cannot be taken seriously and put into play with everything else. So in that sense, they are obstructionist. Traditionalist Maori, or if you have a meeting of two cultures where one is traditionally dominant and people act as if it's dominant and the other one is not important, so that they not only suppress it, that's in the best, but denigrate it, or in some way say that's no good, or that's not moral, and or romanticize it like how it was in the past. Yeah, I think that these are two issues that dialogue goes not only by finding or constantly creating contact. I would say maybe better word would be boundary is very useful metaphor, but encounter is maybe even stronger, where you can actually really meet another you, whether that's a culture or another person.
Well, and then that gets into the notion that Bakhtin talks about being as an event and as a potential within an event. It's not something that pre-exists interaction, right? So we can't look at Maoriness as something that is that doesn't exist. Its existence lies within its contact with others, and what is Maori is defined by what is New Zealand and what is European. I'm not sure that anymore we can split it as an essential element necessarily. Just the notion of calling something spiritual, I'm thinking to myself, in a sense already kind of conjures up for me what is not spiritual. So it's very difficult to sort of like, what defining spirituality. It reminds me of this study, and I apologize, I can't think now of where that was. This study that was done about what is, this study was done in Canada about the Quebec people and what is essentially Quebecois versus what is English. And if somebody knows what I'm talking about, please jump in. But this notion that when you actually ask the Quebecois to define what is uniquely Quebecois about them, they can't come up with anything that is specifically outside of just defining themselves against English. There is nothing out by essentially Quebecois about the Quebecois. Instead, it is just simply they're defining themselves against the English, but there's nothing essentially French Canadian that can be pulled out from, abstracted from them. Abstracted from the events of being, I would say, that are constantly changing and they're constantly being defined in new and different ways. And we're making that, we're creating that all the time, envisioning ourselves with others all the time in different ways. We're making something, but we can't go back and look at it and say that.
Oops. Mark, you switched off your mic.
Oh, I was just saying we can't look back and say that was French Canadian and that isn't. That's not possible to do outside of the events of being, outside of the events of what we're experiencing together all the time.
I want to go back a little bit what Elina was talking about. She asked kind of good questions, and I'm thinking about that, your questions about, which I reinterpret as a question about curriculum. Who decides the curriculum? And the traditional things about that, the decision of the curriculum is for the experts or the people who masters that curriculum. For people who don't master that curriculum, they tell what's important to study, and first study that, and then we will talk about engage you in decision making or even talk to you. By David. In my view, I'm kind of the point that Anna said, which is with reference to Bakhtin about equal consciousness. I think dialogue is very egalitarian in its nature, and it doesn't like hierarchies. And in my view, the practical question that Elina, you asked, my solution is it's my students decide constantly what to study. They decide what's important. By the way, that's answer to Charles as well about Shakespeare. And of course, if you ask my student, like anybody in the studying like new subject, like what you want to study, in many ways they will say, I don't know. Or if they even know something, it might be very superficial. Like, let me turn things around. Like if I all invite you except maybe Elina, all invite you to visit Russia, and you might get excited about that, and then I ask you, where you want to go? What do you want to see? And some people maybe like, you might heard about Red Square, for example, or Moscow, or St. Petersburg, or the Russian ballet. But there are many other things exist. What else, Charles?
Saransk.
Saransk, yes, because that's where Bakhtin worked and taught for some time. Yeah,
You
but
don't
it's
know what you're asking for.
you see that. But the thing is, in my view, it can be that question. If they ask students what do you want to study, it may be not can be not completely helpful. But if you create a lot of possibilities to choosing that, in a way, creating what I call curriculum map, when the students have many, and let's start a journey. And that journey, of course, will find new territories, which is probably not on that map, and they can bring that. And so it's going against Vygotsky and many other ideas about this idea of that the students, it's starting from the students, because it's constantly students are in charge defining their own education. Because they're in position of doing that, because their consciousness with equal rights, the fact that I'm, let's say, together with Elina.
What does it mean, consciousness with equal rights?
It means I'm
a truly Vygotskian person. Okay, never mind.
Well, it means actually that other people can be taken seriously and cannot be overruled based on the, okay, I'm the expert, for example, or I spent all my time in Russia. I know better for you what you need to know about Russia. Actually, I don't. Yes, it's true that I have very different and much rich experience with Russia that probably that other people, some other people, Elina definitely excluded. But maybe, by the way, even that may be question mark. Who knows? Maybe Carlos, I don't know, spent whole his childhood reading and studying Russia and actually visiting that. The fact, I don't know that. But in a way, even if it's true that I know more in that sense, I still don't know what's more important for other people, or where they find their own place in Russia. I don't know that. And in my view, this is like opening up that and deciding together. And I see my role in this case is presenting this curriculum map for my students to choose, and to add, of course, new things because they might heard something and say that I didn't even think about, even if I knew about that in advance.
I'm sorry. Do you remember Kurt Lewin, who said, "You can choose, but who is choosing the choice?"
Exactly, exactly. And in this case, it will be open. We're all creating choices in that sense, because yes, I can generate initial map, but the people start changing that immediately by bringing new, modifying what existing options are, and so on and so forth.
But Eugene, if you're working, let's just think about this pragmatically for a moment. You're confronted, so you say there is equality of consciousness and not hierarchy. This isn't true. You're sitting in a group of a school in any country in a particular time and place, and there is a hierarchy. You cannot avoid that there is a hierarchy. You start from the hierarchy. You don't start with the choice, an equal choice. At some point, the choice emerges, just as a child's voice emerges if you're dealing with children. Children can't decide. If you say to many children what they want to learn, they're going to talk about some conservative thing that's always been in their mind for a long time that they want to keep on learning about. The boys, they want to do more Star Wars, you know, and the girls are going to do this computer game that they're always playing. And this is where Kyo, for example, says, you know, and Gadamer, the event is over the horizon for a start for the children. They will not get there for a start by themselves. You might consider this patriarchal or anything of me, but this is a fact. You make some choices for the children at the beginning that they can't make. Later on, they change that by these significant events in their learning. This is why Vygotsky in our schools, I just say in our schools, Vygotsky is used, probably misused, to define the end point. We want the children to come to this state of consciousness or to have this ability or to understand this. We are going to engineer and design everything. We are going to provide scaffolding. I know this is a misuse of Vygotsky. I understand this, so that we will get to this new state of consciousness. Not at all. What we are saying is we are starting from a difficult hierarchical position. At some point, the children's voice and agency and everything will emerge. And what matters is that we have not decided the outcome. We have not decided where they are going, because we can't decide that.
Hi.
Anna?
I would like to say that we do start from hierarchy in a sense that a child is born and has no ability to even defend itself or live alone or anything. But I think as educators, our goal is to create places, exactly those boundary places on which we can meet with the child on equal terms for education. There are many other things in our lives where we cannot be equal, in school including, and they constantly intrude into that. But I think that for education, you have to talk to the consciousness of the child as you're talking to yourself, in that sense, like talking with a complete seriousness about whatever emerges. That's one thing. Another thing is our, I think, way to do that is to create these points of a contact or these boundaries by bringing something new and novel that will spark the it's not like transmission of ready-made knowledge, but provocations for thinking about new things. I'll just tell you one small thing between me and my son when he was 2 years old. So I said, let's play, and I will be your daughter, you will be my father. Okay, and he will, yeah, okay, let's play that. So I started pretending to be a little daughter and put my finger in my nose, and he suddenly stops and says, girls don't pick their noses. And I said, how do you know? He says, I never saw that before. And that was the beginning of our talk, like who can pick what's picking noses and everything. Because it was just a terrific occasion to talk about things that suddenly that was a point of contact. I didn't tell him you're wrong or yes, they do or whatever.
So Anna, you're saying you created in this encounter, there was equality and that was in the foreground. But the context,
it was a provocation, of course. I know so much about picking noses from experience, much more than you.
Yeah, and in fact, could I say one thing that I wanted to say, that in terms of their quality of being, an 8-year-old can be more playful and subversive than you possibly know in what they're thinking. Yeah. But I'm just talking about the territory in which you are in a school. There is this institutional power that you have. You're kidding yourself if you don't have it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, in my view, Charles, we should not normalize that and naturalize that and say, oh, this is good. Actually, it's good. This is a play. And I hear from you that you're dismissing a lot of things that you disvalue, like kids' games, kids' interests, and so on and so forth. And in my view, that's very problematic. By the way,
no, I'm not dismissing.
No, you just mentioned that.
No, I didn't say. I just said that when we're doing, the school is mandated to teach literacy and numeracy and all these things.
Which is, in my view, oppressive, very oppressive mandate.
Yes, but I understand that. But I'm saying this is a context where our children are. We have not got a revolution. Sure. This is where we are.
Well, that depends on our positions about revolution, not revolution.
So we start from a hierarchy, we start from this position, and we acknowledge that we're the ones who are often driving that, or almost always driving that. But then, of course, we do create that position where we draw on children's interest games and everything that they have and their marvelous existence to become an equal partner of that. Of course we do. But I'm just saying that is usually or often not a good starting point.
I disagree with you, but it's okay. Monica, do you want to join us? Oops.
Hi, I was muted. Well, it's the first time I take part, so I'm more listening, and you know, there are many things going on while you're speaking. I've been thinking about other references. Someone talked about encounters, and it just reminded me of Reijo Miettinen from Helsinki University. He talks about creative encounters and collaborative agency. When people get together to find a solution to something or to solve a situation of crisis, then this this creative encounter gives the possibility of collaborative agency to sort something out or to create this new project. And while you were Eugene, you were talking about the boundaries in the classroom and the silence. That's how I understood, yeah? The power of silence in classroom. And here in Brazil, I've been working with English teaching, and it's English as a foreign language. I work in I can say that's a privileged school, and kids learn English not because they need, but because not because they need to communicate, or it's something else. They learn it because they want a better job. They can have the opportunity to study abroad. It's not exactly to survive, as many immigrants need. As an immigrant who comes from IT, for example, needs to learn Portuguese. Someone who comes from Syria, who comes to Brazil, needs to learn Portuguese. So there are those different boundaries. I don't know if we can say that, but it seems there are boundaries. There are, I don't even know if it's proper or not, but this is something it's coming up to my mind from this discussion. Some boundaries are provoked and some boundaries are created because depends on the needs of each community.
Mm-hmm.
So I've been just following the discussion and trying to figure out and relate to the things I've been working with here in Brazil. Yeah, and we also think about the physical boundaries. As well, as I've just said, I work in a kind of privileged school, but when I go to the streets, I have to be very careful. So there's the physical boundary as well. I mean, I need to be careful because I can be robbed. Well, Brazil, São Paulo's reality, yes?
In Sao Paulo?
Yes, yeah.
I worked in UNESCO.
Okay, yeah, interesting. So I work here in a private school, and by the side of this school, there is a public school. And many times the teenagers who are leaving the public school, they try to rob students or employees who are leaving this school. So somehow we are talking, of course, about education, and there is the physical boundary as well, and this whole idea of inequality, well, and everything else. But just to contribute somehow to the discussion, and not to contribute, but to share the thoughts I've been having while you were talking about so many different things.
It's kind of interesting what I hear, Monica, interesting things about like treating other people as objects, like you can get money from them, or you can actually treat them instrumentally, like in collaboration. I'm in contact with you just because I need to accomplish something. And I cannot accomplish by myself, so I need you to accomplish. But otherwise, if I could have accomplished by myself, goodbye. I don't need you. And I think this is what Martin talks about contact, is he talks about contact for the contact's sake, not because it's useful for accomplishing something, not because it's activity, some kind of activity, but because it's a way of being together. It's because when a human realize with themselves, we are here not because because I can use you to achieve something, or you are my object because I can get something from you or steal something, but because we are just two humans, and I feel I just need you because I'm incomplete. in the sense that I'm attracted to the other person, and my loneliness drives me crazy when I'm just with only myself. And this is kind of, it's very interesting aspects that you brought to our discussion, I think.
I wanted to come back briefly to what Charles was talking about, and what you, Eugene, were talking about consciousness, the quality of consciousness, and then whether, and given freedom of choice to children or students in what they want to study. That I think that the issue is much more complex because by like I used to work with people who did organic curriculum where everything emerged from the student question. And then you kind of work with those student questions, you transform, reform them, and open up different fields of study. What happened is I was questioning myself whether we're giving these children equity of access to different mapping for them. Especially if you talk about children of color in the city schools, I was thinking, you know, I worked in the Bronx in some schools where teenagers thought Manhattan was a different state. Although they were 20 minutes away from 20 minutes away, and when we needed a museum trip, they were absolutely unaware that it was so easy to get to that new state that was Manhattan. And that was quite striking for me and for the some of my student teachers. So what I'm talking about, if I would start with these students in those schools, with whatever is immersion, building with them curriculum, I might not widen some context of learning for them. If I'm just trying it, I'm just trying for the sake of the argument, and also if I act, even offering the choice in a different cultural mode, that it might not be even accepted. So as a choice to choose what to study. So in other words, whether it's possible to do it, yes, but then I will lose another probably 3 months on doing this, on preparing them to choose, maybe not lose, maybe it's the wrong word. So it's a very hard choice with understanding of equality of consciousness and participation. In my educational experiences in different countries, in those different contexts, I learned that I need to empower students to choose. I need to give some tools, right, before they start choosing. Okay, that's good. You disagree. Okay.
No, of course I disagree. I disagree on many levels. One thing, it's all of this idea is empowerment, in my view, very disrespectful. And by the way, it's Bakhtin said not about equal consciousness. Consciousness never equal to each other. Not because of the power, just because we're so different. Why to have equality about that? I'm so glad that I'm not equal to Elina, to you, because this is a gift to me. Never. Plus, it's even impossible to know what's equal, what not, because for that we need to get inside each of us and have kind of bird view, whether or not we're equal or not equal.
I was just trying to quote you, so I misquoted.
No, it's right. By the way, it's my also was, for a long time I thought it was equal consciousness while reading that. It took me a while to realize, oh, it's actually, he talks about rights, not consciousness, equality of rights. And in this case, this idea that we need to empower somebody, in my view, it's very bizarre. And you bring an example. We don't know so many things. It's actually very, in my view, wrong idea to think, oh, you're bringing this example that black students didn't know that Manhattan is not a state. So what he thought that it's a state? We're full of this. If each of us, here, like right now, full of these so-called misconceptions, wrong things, and so on and so forth. in my view, the goal of education is not to clear.
Not the point. The point, they didn't know it existed and was
So
an
what?
option.
And they didn't know that it exists, Manhattan, Manhattan. I don't know so many things in the, probably in New Zealand or in any place. It's of course, it's very natural, not knowing is natural. It's the purpose of education is not to eliminate ignorance. The goal of education is how people.
It was not their choice of not knowing.
Just a sec, let me finish. The purpose of education in this case, for people who wants to know and they face the situation when they need to know at hand, how to do that. And part of this education is about that. It's about education on demand, here and now. It's not preparing for life, which is whole idea. Not to provide tools to them. It's not about tools. It's about how we're going to deal with the situation when we don't know something and we want to know something. And the point is, for that, the students need to want to know something. In this case, back to quickly to Monica, students, we have assumption that students need to know something, but they might not need to know that, or they might need for different reasons. And I think this diversity of these approaches, where some people say, I don't know to know about that right now. Maybe in future, yes, but not now. And for now, I need this. But for reason for that, you might not respect that reason, but this is what I need. Can you help me? Yes, you can. Thanks. If you cannot, goodbye. Anna?
Yeah, I just also want to say that when you said, Elina, I want to go back to you, it's not their choice. Of course, our ignorance and our knowledge is not always, and most of the time, is not a choice. But it's a matter of creating rich learning environment, not obliging people to to drink the water, but just bring the water and bring the cookies and bring everything that's for learning there. To be in other words, to have a lot of boundaries, a lot of places that can be encountered, a lot of ways to encounter it, and create just a really rich place where there are so many interesting, lively things going on, people doing things, people talking about things, and children will be exposed not because they naturally learn, but because in a naturally stimulating and rich environment, there will be all kinds of things to attract their attention and to attract their learning. And sometimes from need, sometimes just because it's something is interesting. That's
Could I just mention, Eugene, one of the reasons that I think choice isn't the main issue when we start off in learning is because it seems the best way to give choice is not to start there at the beginning. And often the children that we encounter at school already, they have all kinds of habits of learning which have come from being part of pedagogy, the kind that we don't like, for a long, long time. They've been part of that. So if you say to them, okay, what do you think, or where are we going to start, or all the rest, that doesn't necessarily draw on who they are or what they think or who they are. I agree with you in the first place. It is not about making them better people. It is not about thinking about the future, all those things. It is coming to the present moment, but you don't start with the present. You have to come to the present. The present isn't there. You are in this virtual world that has been created, this unnatural territory. To come to where you want the children to have those encounters that Anna describes, you have to create these provocations and these boundaries. And then when those moments when they start to require choice and voice, that's a marvelous thing. But it doesn't happen in a literal way. That's what I wanted to say. And the only other thing is, once I worked in a school on a hippie commune. So it was turning into a difficult situation on this commune. There was no electricity. It was miles from nowhere. You couldn't get there on the road. You had to cross a big river, walk a long way. Everyone thought, why are you going to live in this crazy hippie commune? I said, it's interesting. I want to see what it's like. And all the parents said, we don't want to start from this kind of big total fuck up of society. Children, no one has any freedom. No one has any choice. We want the children to be able to do anything they're able to do. I'm one of the few teachers who has taught in a hippie commune in the wilderness, right? It was a horrendous experience. Everybody has a choice, but actually what their children are doing is mainly carrying out their parents' ideological arguments in front of you. So, you know, 5-year-olds come to school and the next thing that happens is some of the parents think it's okay to be naked. So they're walking in and the men are standing there stark naked. All the children are distracted. They cannot focus on the book, the picture book, because the man standing naked is more impressive. Firstly, next thing, the parents say, we don't want to decide whether or not how the children sit in class. I said, that's fine. If they can learn sitting any way they want. One girl, she wants to sit in the lotus position on her desk. She's 5. She keeps on falling off. So I say, actually, Katie May, I'd like you to try sitting on the floor. Next, the father turns up naked and angry. You cannot do this. This is not why you have come here. We are in this new position. Children must have choice. So I think the idea of choice is a very contestable and difficult one. I know this is only a parody I'm giving you. I know you don't think that's what choice is, but I'm just saying you come to the present. You don't start from the present.
Charles, can I say something? It's very interesting that you say hippie commune and all these things going on. I've been studying recently some democratic schools and how they started, and one of the things that is my big learning is that transition from an autocratic kind of regime to a democratic regime is not easy at all, and requires a lot of, as you say, premises that you know. One of the big problems, let's say, in Sweden and Norway when they started with these schools in the 60s, is that the people thought that the freedom is unlimited freedom for everyone, and that's that hippie idea that you're talking about. Like, I now want to sing inside of your class. I just have a freedom to do whatever I want, to come naked or to sing something loud, and that's my freedom. You know? But that's not a democratic school.
No, I know that. I know, yeah.
Right. There are so many interesting things. I think that when we are talking about them, we assume a lot of things that are from the traditional autocratic school as being normal. And then as disrupting them, we go in our assumptions in many wrong ways until we find what's the best for that group of people at that time. What kind of a solution or what kind of temporary conceptualization is the best. One other thing that when I was a parent of the semi-democratic school, it was democracy for adults, but for children not quite. One of the things that I noticed is the children who start in that kind of education that has a lot of let's say limited choices and limited possibilities of dialogue and everything. They socialize not in the what's knowledge, but they socialize in how to relate to another person in a way that is more free and democratic, and in a way like your students when they tell you, I totally disagree with you, Charles, but that's not with disrespect. It's a dialogic turn in deciding what you think or what I think, or when we are talking right now.
Yeah.
Well, the children and the adults in traditional school, because of that non-equality of consciousness as being normal, any kind of break of that seems to be either impossible. And, you know, once you learn as a child that you should not be talking unless somebody asks you a question, you forget to ask the questions yourself. And then when you ask people what you want to do, they don't know, because they never even thought that they would even be asked that they should have some want to learn or something like that. I just think that there is so many things that that are very, very different when you are already learning from a very early age, or not say learning, but existing in a democratic or a situation in which you can have equal rights. One interesting thing that Jim Rietmulder, who is a founder of the Circle School recently wrote in his new book is that a democratic school creates this environment in which people can exist in an educational way, so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel in every class and to swim against the current, and at the same time start to create a new culture of equal consciousness and want to focus on some exploration of contact or creation of something with your students. So there is a completely different level, and establishing a democratic school or a democratic learning community is something that takes a long time, a lot of effort, and never finishes, because it's also always evolving and creating. But at this moment, except for these few amount of schools that are working like that, in every other situation in conventional schools, we have to create these bubbles, and it's twice as much energy and sometimes totally wrong energy, because we are constantly fighting things in order just to create a little space for actually things going on like it's going on in your dramatic classes, where you have to fight against what parents think and what the authorities think, and they have to protect actually your children and yourself from these kinds of like really putting roadblocks and barriers, not even boundaries, but real barriers for learning. That's
And in my view, the one thing that I've learned from democratic schools, and which is what Bakhtin's notion of consciousness with equal rights, is respect of non-participation, which means kids, sorry Charles to say, I don't need your lessons. I'm not interested in your lessons. Goodbye, Charles. And second thing is non-imposition of the curriculum, which means you want to teach that Shakespeare, and I don't want to study Shakespeare right now. Goodbye, Charles.
But if they want to study Shakespeare...
But they want, if they want. Notice that, if they want, many problems that you're talking, Charles, will disappear. If they want. If they want. It will disappear because it will be negotiable, very easy negotiable. If the girl much more interested about sitting in Lotus right now rather than participating in your lesson, she might not be part of that because that's not what she's up to right now. But if she comes to do something, if she really wanted to do that Lotus stuff will be on the way for her, first of all, not for you. It will be a problem for her, not for you, first of all. And that creates a very different environment. And I saw that. It's not imaginary things. Democratic school exists. I recommend you to visit them. When kids have right not to participate and there is no imposition of curriculum.
There is an annual conference every year. I'm on the board of American Alternative Education.
Elina, when it will be and where this year? Because each time I couldn't.
Okay, it was in Portland this year, but I don't know where it will be next year. But there is a great variety within democratic schools, and there are radical samples like Sudbury Valley School or Summerhill. Summerhill was not radical, but they are not necessarily, it's an interesting separate conversation, because by defining them as democratic, it does not necessarily mean they're dialogic.
Exactly. I agree.
And if they have different like decision making and organic questioning and things like this, sometimes they're not really offering the children's voices to emerge in the discussion, because it's superficial decision making that is not necessarily requires children to engage on a deeper level. So that's also tricky. My son used to go to Jewish school where there was a dialogic reflection, as they call it, all the time. And he learned the mode, and he never engaged on a meaningful level. So it's also tricky sometimes, because.
By the way, Elina, I again very closely observing and this circle school, which is in Harrisburg. One thing that amazed me there and surprised and puzzles that indeed it's very little places for dialogue, at least on the surface. It's heavily based on procedural democracy, rule-based, and so on and so forth. But the children there are extremely thoughtful and extremely dialogic when you talk to them.
Yes.
And that become interesting for me. Where the hell it's happened? Because it's happened. It's not because it's self-selecting process. I already noticed that. So I couldn't figure out, put my finger what they doing right. Because this type of the procedural democracy, it's about not very dialogic.
No.
You saw that. So where is whole things? It sounds like there is something going on underneath of that, which they, by the way, openly talk about. They create conditions. The whole thing is creating conditions. But where is realization of that? That's a very interesting question.
I'm going to give you a very unscientific, completely unprocessed thought.
Please.
I don't know, but it just plainly means in these schools versus traditional American public schools that are schooling machines, where there is very little talking. I'm not talking about dialogue, but very little talking where child even have a space for. And in these democratic schools, even if it's superficial, they're constantly poked and asked, do you like this book? Do you want this book? Like, why did you choose this? There is a constant questioning, do you want the school to do this or that? And so they're put in this situation, even if it's a superficial, but they have to actively engage and do something. And then they learn that in democratic meetings, those who are active, they might get their point across, and they will have to abide by that rule in the future. So they start being active and articulating and trying to learn how to voice their concerns or something. That's a very bottom line level. So in regular spaces, even at home sometimes, nobody asks them what book to read. This is a very good book. Why don't you open and read it for 10 minutes? Why 10 minutes? Okay, I've seen this. Even in a very liberal families. But they're constantly questioned. So that will be my uneducated guess.
I think,
Very
Neil was talking in Summerhill about just getting out of the way, giving them freedom, and for Neil, freedom would cure everything.
I don't know.
I know that.
Get me there. Get me there.
I'm not saying that I agree.
I'm not there.
But I'm just saying that in
First
context
of all, you can't give freedom. You can't give freedom.
Yep. Good point, Elina. I agree with you.
Yeah.
It's not something that people empower or giving to other people.
No, I wanted to say that. I wanted to say
it's usually reverse. People take out freedom.
Yeah.
That's what happened.
Yeah, I wanted to say it in context. I wanted to say it in a different context. I wanted to say it in a context like get out of their way, in the sense that's why we don't know how it happens, because we are not there. And you're right, that democratic school does not always mean dialogic school. And that was one of our big issues talking with Jim Rittmulder, that, just getting out of the way doesn't mean anything.
Anna, this is not the point. The point is reverse. It's look like not dialogic, but it is. That's what it is. Interesting. No, it's reverse thing. It's reverse thing.
But
it's not dialogic, but it is.
We have access, and at some point, I even happened to come to anarchist conference. There was very crazy schoolings, and they had more structure to preserve anarchy than I've ever seen.
That's very interesting.
So it's kind of sometimes,
Because it's political anarchy. It's not educational anarchy, it's political one. So it's like for education to support anarchic society with an anarchic vision of the society. This is very different idea that when we talk about democratic schools, we're talking about not to schools that teach democracy. No, it's schools that democracy is how to say that, it's a fabric of the school. Democratic decision making, it's a fabric of school rather than preparing or supporting democratic society.
Yeah, you know, I'm familiar with John Dewey schools, and I have a lot of tremendous respect for all the schools, even in different ways. And I did study on that, so I know like a little bit even more than in books of how school functions as a human association. And although his concept of democracy and his ideas of continuity of learning experiences, how you establish the fluid weaving of learning into fabric of all these school practices, it's truly amazing. Like several schools in New York, I've seen, and one Russian school actually self-identified.
Really? Wow.
As well, according to my survey, as a Jewish school, and I also had the experience of my child going into one, and I'm really thankful for that school, City and Country School in New York. But so they also call themselves democratic schools. That's the point I brought it up, and they are very, very different. And Dewey is often perceived as a kind of voice for democratic education.
No, he is progressive. He's not democratic.
Right. Okay, let's not. It depends. Like, you know, we have theories and then we have practical implications, and sometimes they are not necessarily aligned.
Sure.
I mean, by definition, they shouldn't be. So, I mean, I'm talking about Dewey schools and some practices that emerged over years, and they're truly interesting for children to develop their voices. And those democratic schools will be their voice and position, but I can't tell you that it will be organized completely freely, like choose whatever you want to do. Of course not. I mean, in those schools, it's not. But they're mastering social practices. In my speaking about freedom, like one of the insights of my cross-cultural study was when I talk about freedom, both schools, one in Russia in Moscow, one in New York, self-identify themselves as Dewey schools. So I'm controlling the school culture. So, and both value freedom. Lots of teachers, everybody speaks about freedom in this or that way, indirectly or directly. But then through data, I'm discovering that freedom, how do you develop free action? So for Russians, school, although it was anti-Vygotsky and anti-everything, okay, so school of self-determination. So, but you develop freedom. You first have a freedom of mind. And freedom of mind will transfer in the freedom of action. Here in New York, they say, no, we're going to have penny harvest. We're going to march on Martin Luther King, holiday. They need experience of freedom. And then they might develop a freedom of mind. So that was like fascinating for me to discover.
For me, what's interesting is it's decision for the students what freedom is, not for the students' own decision what does it mean freedom.
No, I understand that, right? But I thought it was fascinating.
No, it is fascinating. It is fascinating. But it's fascinating again based to this idea that freedom is designed by kind of benevolent dictators who actually will give this freedom to the students, oppressed masses. Again, this avant-garde party who will decide what is free. I'm actually talking to Elina because it's kind of communist jargon from the Soviet Union. Guys, I need to go now, and sorry to guys interrupt you because now I'm really dictator, unfortunately, because I can leave you.
Democracy is over.
No, it's just because I control this stupid Zoom.
Okay.
But you can continue. It's just like
it's okay.
I think we are already 2.5 hours.
Yes, I think we are more than enough.
I think we are coming to the second and third drink, according to Sidor, and starting
Which would be very helpful.
Yeah, because we are talking about nothing anymore. That's our topic. We are off the topic, but it doesn't matter. It's very
Who
interesting.
said that?
Interesting.
We just started talking, finally.
You got to go. Now that is the best, right?
What would be helpful on a pragmatic note? I mean, I don't know all the people who were on the call. How do we learn about each other? Like people who are talking to
Okay, we usually put that on the Facebook. You probably saw it from the Facebook. How did you learn about this Zoom conversation?
I saw, and I made time. I ran from work.
Well, and then what we do, we try to coordinate by asking people what's the best time for them. Usually we don't
No,
take
I mean,
much care.
I mean, a little. Do you have like who the people are, where they from? You know.
Where the people from? You know, we did the introduction at the beginning, but the problem is beginning is different for different people. It depends when you come, and we cannot interrupt and start. No. It's not like I'm trying to say. It's a problem.
But
Because,
I think if you save it, save podcast, and go back, it would be helpful.
Yeah. That's what we'll do. We'll do. But unfortunately, you know what? Maybe we should do. Maybe people who come join later, maybe they should also introduce themselves. Because that's missing. Because
in the chat, maybe at least, or at the when they first start talking.
But if you, I didn't.
Oh, I see. You mean when you first start talking, you introduce.
When you start first talking, just say like Monica. It's so useful that she mentioned that she's from Brazil, from São Paulo.
Right.
Yeah.
And Carlos is from New Mexico. Actually, I thought that he was from Brazil too. It turns out
he's from New Mexico, and Charles from New Zealand.
Charles is from New Zealand, and he's in New
Very
Zealand.
far.
And not only he's in New Zealand, it's winter there, and not only it's winter there, but Charles.
It's winter in Brazil as well.
You know, Charles is back. Is completely naked there because the wind is blowing. I mean, his house is broken in the back. His roof is broken. His wall is broken.
Wow.
And cold wind behind that nice red curtain is
behind the curtain. Yeah. But I did want to say one of the things that strikes me about these conversations is a lot of it. You know, if we were going to talk about Bakhtin and about theoretism, I think the problem is that. We're having all these arguments, they're very, very useful arguments and all this, but it's very, very difficult to convey these. All of us have these different experiences of schools. And sometimes, if you like the question of shy or not, for example, these are so deeply rooted in our conversation. I mean, you know, for example, Eugene, I'm not against democratic schools, not in any way. I think they're great. And we have a tradition in Australia and New Zealand of democratic schools. Our public schools here will be very different from schools in US or some schools, just because, for one reason, that the influence of the tangata whenua and Māori culture has had a big influence on New Zealand culture and how it's developed. So all these things are so different. So we think we're talking about the same thing, but sometimes we're not. Yeah.
Yeah, that was my point when Carlos was talking about destroying boundaries. I thought he meant something very different.
Yeah.
Because I had similar experiences that to even engage in a conversation. So it's like boundaries or walls or borders, right?
Yeah.
But another thing that I want to say in response to you, sometimes we naturalize our conditions and take it as a given as if they're actually good, rather than fighting this oppressive. And sometimes we compromise. But instead of seeing that we're compromising that, we think, oh, this is a good theoretical principle because this is the good idea to start with. Rather than see, well, we're just weak, we compromise, we need to survive, or we will be crushed. And that's true, all of that, that's true, but it should be not seen as our local conditions, in the sense that it's a different ways of being. No, it's not. It's just like different oppressions in which we might, and we find ourselves, and we're making a lot of stand on that, heroic stand. Sometimes we're going against that. Sometimes we surrender certain things. But that's also important in my view. Rather than naturalizing and say, oh, you just guys don't know what you're talking about. I'm working in that conditions. Well, you're working in that condition, and that can be oppressive, but it doesn't mean that we should accept that.
Or well, sometimes it means that the person cannot, in that moment of their lives, change things.
Yeah, and that's fine, to accepting that, to recognizing that. What's not fine is you say, oh, this is actually, it's actually kids don't have free, they don't know freedom. They talk as a parents talk. This is, sorry to say, Charles, and I don't buy that. This is patronizing of children, in my view.
No,
it's true.
no, I'm not.
It's true
No,
that
no.
it's true that you can hear a lot of voices of the parents, and this is part of education is about, to exactly help to see how kids colonized by bringing a contact with other things, and to see whether kids like that or not like that.
No, Eugene, but it's not either or, you know, it's not an either or. That's the thing that I'm saying. And children come from a scene of learning at their families, which is
But we're all coming that. Don't separate us from children. I'm also coming from the things that I'm colonized by the things and not seeing that. I'm not talking, it's things talking through me in many ways.
But we're talking about children, aren't we? We're talking about children. That's
no, we're talking about people. We're talking about people.
I'm giving you an example. Today we talked about dialogue as transformative boundary crossing, and I gave specific examples of children doing things and saying things that showed that they had therefore been transformed in that situation. In my opinion, that's what I saw them doing. And the discussion came as to how that learning was initiated. And I don't think where it begins, a disagreement between you and me, is you say where it begins is somehow a pivot, is crucial. I say, no, it's not. Learning is hybridized, and as just all the spaces are overlapping all the time, so we have overlapping narratives. And if the narrative doesn't begin with what the children say, at some point the children must, what they say and what their questions are must be crucial for the learning to be authentic. It doesn't need to begin there though.
I disagree with that, because everything starts with the person and not with something out there. Things start with the person in contact.
There is no internal territory. It's just overlapping territory.
Exactly. And but there is no it's not that.
What is this mystical person, Eugene? What is this person who you feel? So this is the essence of life. This person and their identity is the most important thing. No, it's not.
By the way, identities. You probably know that Mark and I wrote a book article against notion of identity.
No, I don't.
So,
I'd like to.
And I need to go. I think this is the call.
Yeah.
Sorry. We will continue. Thanks, Charles, for bringing this topic.
Maybe that would be a good topic to discuss later, identity.
Yeah.
Okay.
Identity.
Yes.
I will put the new voting. So bring that. Okay.
So okay, good. Thank you. Thanks. Bye, Monica.
Bye, Monica. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Goodbye, Monica. See you.
Ciao, Monica.
Bye bye. Ciao, ciao.